Welcome to this Esade webinar, and thank you very much for joining us in this new session of Stay Connected. The Stay Connected sessions are the Esade initiative that aims to accompany through knowledge, analysis, and reflection the challenge posed by current situation. I am Angel Saz Carranza, Associate Professor of Strategy at Esade and Director of Esade Geo, Esade's center dedicated to the study of geopolitics and business. Esade Geo is chaired by Javier Solana and counts with researchers, professors, and scholars studying, among other things, global governance and business, EU policy and business, international political uncertainty and business, with a particular focus on trade, energy, and cyber. You can visit our web and follow us on Twitter. In this webinar, together with Enrique Rueda, a senior fellow of Esade Geo, we are going to try to think what possible futures might come up in the aftermath of the crisis. Enrique is an expert in the use of scenarios in long-term strategizing and strategy making, and is advisor to some of the world's top firms. Enrique is based in Washington, D.C., but was born in Spain, did his undergrad at Esade, and eventually became director of strategy at the World Bank and at Cisco before becoming a senior advisor at Boston Consulting Group. At the end of his presentation, we will answer the questions that can be asked through the LinkedIn and YouTube channels. Without further ado, Enrique, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Angel. Good afternoon, buenas tardes, or good morning if you are near where I am. And we have a lot of ground to cover, and both some principles about what scenarios can serve for, and some examples of how we can apply them now. Our friendly colleagues behind the webinar at Esade have given us a very tight time frame, so I may be speaking kind of fast, but you'll have a chance to ask questions afterwards, and I hope then you'll also, we will leave you with food for thought that you will find stimulating. Let me start by showing a basic slide on what does it mean to develop scenarios, and what's the basic difference between scenarios and predictions. And a simple way of thinking about it is prediction, you usually have one prediction in singular, and I'm sure you've seen a lot of experts predicting what's going to happen now. A very dangerous thing to do, because as we have learned, particularly in recent years and certainly in recent months, in recent weeks, very, very hard. Okay. Very, very hard to figure out what's going to be the outcome of a very uncertain situation. And that's why scenarios are a way of of thinking about the future in plural, acknowledging the fact that we cannot predict it, and yet that doesn't mean that we cannot prepare for it. Preparing for possible futures, thinking about what if, is a much more effective way of anticipating what we may have to react to. And that's why scenarios are useful. Very quickly, a sense of how we can develop scenarios, and then we will apply these basic principles. First, really important is to identify critical uncertainties, factors that will change what we know that we have to deal with in our context, and that also have a lot of uncertainty. It's not just that these factors are important, but the ones that are uncertain are the ones that we need to explore. And once we've identified them, we can think about, so what are the plausible outcomes for these uncertainties? Think about extreme alternatives that are still plausible. The really powerful thing uh, with scenarios is when you start looking at the interplay of uncertainties, thinking about the intersection of different things that often we think about in isolation, and that when you combine them and look at the potential impact of these intersections, they start unveiling insights that are much richer than individual uncertainties. So right now, in this situation that we are facing, we can use scenarios in two ways, and that's what we are going to do in the next few minutes. First, on the resolution of the current crisis. How could it look in a few months' time? And then on the longer term dynamics that this may trigger, and that it may be the kinds of things that we may need to adjust to fairly fundamentally. So let's start with two basic sets of uncertainties. And I'm going to focus, which is unusual because scenarios are usual normally for the longer term, but I'm just going to focus on the next 6 months. And I think, given the situation that we have with the virus, one important question is, where will we be in 6 months? Where will the virus advance find itself? And the second um, question that will determine what world we are finding ourselves in. And remember, we are particularly thinking about economics and markets and economic policy decisions. Right? So, what degree of market disruption and economic turmoil will there be? Um, and if we think at that first snapshot of October 2020, 6 months from now, how can we think about the situations that we could find? These plural snapshots, not a prediction. You see many predictions, you can believe them or not. I am a skeptical strategist. The only way to do good strategy is to be skeptical about the future and to think through what could happen. What if? So we're going to explore these three time horizons very quickly. October 2020, as I mentioned, particularly in terms of what's happening with the virus advance and with the economic response, the kinds of economic dynamics that this will trigger, say, from the end of this year and 2 more years. And then we will start a conversation and a bit of brainstorming together with Angel on what does this mean in terms of how the world could change. And this may take a few more years. Some of these things may be pretty fundamental things that will affect anybody, anywhere, in a pretty deep kind of rethink your strategy way. So thinking about the virus advance, and where could we be in October 2020? The two ends, opposing ends of this possible spectrum of plausible outcomes, is that on the one hand, the virus continues to spread. We see multiple waves. In many countries, social distancing is just too hard for people to really stick to long enough. And the combination of all of these, a very kind of a virus that resists AC solutions, etc., means that in 6 months' time, we're still battling in many countries, in many parts of the world, battling this virus, and only limited progress has been made. That's something that clearly is a possibility that we need to think through. The other end of this spectrum, and the question is not important exactly how it happens, but you have a lot of progress on treatment. You have persistence in social distancing. People realize that this is an unusual situation. You have to stick with it. And then you find that some readily available drug can be repurposed, and progress is being made on a vaccine. So you have one end of the spectrum that is a kind of optimistic one if you want, but with things that we see clearly that make it plausible. The second axis is about economic turmoil. And here, essentially, you have a combination of the effort in terms of economic response by governments and the effectiveness of that effort. So, in the situation where you have a lot of economic turmoil, which I call here unbridled, you have that trade barriers have been persisting. There has not been coordination or solidarity in terms of financial interventions, and the stimulus programs that have been put in place are either too tepid or very populist and therefore not strategically effective. The other end of the spectrum, the nice side of the spectrum, if you want, is economic stimulus have managed to come up with a large enough effort, a nice, kind of a good strategic combination of business lifelines and demand support. In parallel, there's been a drop in barriers to trade and services, which facilitates cooperation, and it also helps the world, which may become a really important thing, to deal with countries that are the weak global francs of the overall world. So we have these two fairly major uncertainties with very different outcomes. And this takes us to naturally to four scenarios. Four scenarios that it's important to consider. And I will preempt the question that always comes. I do not attribute any probability to these scenarios. The value of the scenarios is to make sure that you think through each of them as if it is the one that you are going to have to deal with. Because the value of the scenarios is to prepare for all these what if situations. So you have kind of on the northwest quadrant, onerous strait, there's been a big effort on the economic front. There's been a fair amount of progress in terms of having effective stimulus programs, but the virus still kind of um, with us. We haven't managed to conquer that, and it has not decided to go away. Um, Now, on the northeast quadrant, what you have is a world where there's been effective stimulus and where the advance of the virus has been repressed. And therefore, you have a pretty different dynamic, and we will get into what that means in a moment. In the southeast quadrant, fortuitous isolation, not because the response has been very effective, but you could even say out of luck. The fact is that we've managed to contain the virus, or the virus has petered out. I think there are a lot of experts that are considering the possibility that viruses are not kind of are perishable. Something happens. The issue on the health front is mostly solved, but the economic interventions and therefore the term the turmoil is fairly significant because the interventions haven't been effective enough. And I don't think I need to tell you very much about the southwest quadrant, where you have the virus still very active, a health situation that is pretty bad, and the major economic turmoil because economic responses, economic policies, stimulus have not been effective, strategic, or significant enough. So, what does it mean in 6 months' time in each of these worlds? Well, in fortuitous isolation, you have very weak business confidence. You can imagine that asset and commodity markets will remain quite soft. And you have some recovery because the virus has retreated, but fairly timid recovery both in trade and in demand because of the lack of confidence generally. And this is just kind of the tip of the iceberg indications of what the world could look like. Again, very clear that in defensive disarray, you're going to have widespread unemployment, probably also social tensions. You are going to have a further collapse on asset and commodity prices, and you are going to see just about all sectors being badly hit by this situation, a pretty nasty environment to live in. Um, Forward coalition, it's the most positive of the scenarios. And you can see strong recovery, including on trade and travel, which travel may be an interesting symptom of recovery from this crisis. There is solid demand pickup in all sectors and strong asset and commodity prices. And then finally, onerous trade is somewhat more ambiguous world. I can imagine here, because this is a world with a reasonable amount of solidarity. People have started trying to figure out how to help each other and so on. That may lead to lessening unemployment by having some underemployment, sharing jobs, etc. You have trade and recovery and shipping recovery, as well as demand overall, very uneven. So in some sectors, this will happen. In some parts of the world, this will happen, etc. So this is the four snapshots that you could find just in 6 months' time, because things are happening so fast, both on the health front and on the economic front. And so, what does this mean in terms of the next 3 years? And this is just a very simple way of representing how the global economy could look like in each of these scenarios. You have in forward coalition what a lot of people are calling a V path drop, which is going to be fairly unavoidable over the next couple of quarters, and then a fairly strong recovery to kind of normal before crisis trend growth. Um, and then you have on the other end of the spectrum in this defensive disarray is a drop, further drop, and then a very, very limited recovery to well below par growth. You have onerous trade where, because of the health situation, it takes a little bit longer to recover. The recovery is more promising because of solid economic responses. Fortuitous isolation, you have a shorter crisis and a recovery that is not quite as strong because the fundamentals of how the economic response have happened make it that way. You will notice that there are some numbers here, and it's when I came up with these graphs first, maybe they don't look so different, maybe they don't give you a sense of how huge the differences are. So these numbers in $1 trillion are how much will the global GDP increase between 2019 and 2022 in each of these scenarios. And you can see $8 trillion in the forward coalition scenario, $3 trillion only in defensive disarray. Huge differences. Think about what that means in terms of jobs, demand, and all kinds of things that will affect you, whatever sector you are in, whether you are focusing on supply or focusing on demand. So that is where we will find ourselves going um, in each of these worlds, thinking through what it means for you, what it means for the company that you are in or the institution that you are in, and how would you react to each of these worlds is much more effective than thinking about what is the outcome that I expect, that some expert has told me to expect, or even worse, what we unfortunately all tend to do. This is the outcome that I hope will happen. And preparing for a hopeful outcome is not a very good idea. Preparing for a range of outcomes that include some hopeful ones and some dismal ones is a much more effective way of going forward. But as I mentioned before, this is a crisis that is going to affect a lot of the, the way in which both societies and economies operate. And therefore, I think it's an interesting moment to start thinking about how could this crisis and the recovery and the mode of recovery from the crisis, how could this change our world, and how can we understand this potential change, understand the signals that will be taking us to one world or the other, so that we can prepare for it. And the kinds of themes that one may want to think through in each of these scenarios when you are now going forward a few years. Is what we have in this slide just as thought starters, and we could very much welcome online or offline conversation of this. But you can think about in a world of onerous trades where probably because in this world it is China and Korea and a few other countries that have, maybe Germany, have managed to come out ahead faster, better. You have a big acceleration of geoeconomic shifts that were already in place with implications for everybody. Because this is a world where a lot of people have had to spend a lot of time shifting from presential physical involvement with others to virtual, it will have been a major kind of force adjustment and experimentation out of which we will never look back. And virtual everything will be something that we had been talking about for years. Now is happening, is accelerating. The forward coalitions world would bring a lot of global cooperation. And of course, here you can immediately think about what that could imply for efforts on climate change. The bad news here is this is probably a world where inequality will get even worse. And therefore, we have to figure out how to deal with that. At the opposite end of the spectrum, this defensive disarray, you have massive amount of distrust and neglect of vulnerable people. Public services will shrunk, will probably have to just prioritize urgent things, and this will be a pretty tough world when again lots of thinking about how do you adjust to that world will be important. And finally, in our last world, fortuitous isolation, this is probably local is beautiful, communities are more important, cities are more important. And I would not be surprised if in this world there's a big backlash against these digital empires, the mega tech, and therefore anybody in that world, around that world, linked to that world, would need to think through how that happens. So just thought starters, and I know that Angel has also been thinking about this, and he will also share with us some of his thoughts on how can we start using the scenarios to consider possible ways in which pretty fundamentally our world in 5 years' time will be different from today.
Thank you very much, Enrique, for this quick review. Um, uh, a couple of comments, perhaps, regarding the last scenarios you were talking about, the 2025 view. The Northwest quadrant, the honor straight quadrant, would be a world of globalization constrained by health issues, by limited control of the virus, this one or other related ones, where we would imagine different recoveries due to different health, different debt situations in different countries. Um, Probably a place where there is a will for more global governance and more coordination, but perhaps less happening in that sense. One of the most interesting quadrants for me to think about in terms of geopolitics, global governance, and global economy is the southeastern quadrant, the local is beautiful quadrant you were just mentioning right now. That is perhaps one scenario where the globalization as we know it, the past 30 to 40 years of globalization would take a very different turn. Um, and that would also be a scenario where we would see state market relationships to differ profoundly, which um, it seems very interesting to think about in the days we're in today. Um, um, just another note to underscore what you were saying, Enrique, which is from here on, the idea is to think about How are you preparing for these different scenarios? And perhaps uh, let me send you a question, Enrique, to start off. And it's so: is it possible? How, in your experience, how do businesses prepare for these for such a diverse set of possibilities? What are the processes, the ideas, the solutions that you've seen around where you're trying to adapt to such a diverse set of futures?
Yes, that's the tough question, and the answer is that that's why we have a set of scenarios, not one scenario. And essentially, the most effective way of using scenarios for business strategy or for the strategy of any organization, it could be a business school. For instance, I think in the very first webinar, Coldo Echevarria, the Director General of Esade, was talking about the challenges of leadership and how they apply. And I think he was referring to scenarios in plural as one way of preparing. Now, the way you do it is think of the scenarios as kind of wind tunnels. So you have a strategy now, or you have a set of strategic options that you are considering and how to respond to this moment. And you take them through each of the scenarios. And you will see that they work or do not work, or work well or don't work so well in each of the scenarios. And then comparing across the scenarios, it will give you a pretty good sense of how resilient your strategy is. And that's one of the big values. So if you find things that work in all of the scenarios, clearly that should be the foundation of your strategy. You can't always do that. But if not, if you decide you do that exercise, you're sticking to your basic strategy. The scenarios still have a very valuable um, thing that they can contribute. And that is essentially that they have already, by playing that role of wind tunnels, they've helped you develop a strategic radar that is much richer than the one you had before. And if you want, you can think of it also as an alarm system. So you don't know how the world is going to go. You have some scenarios that tell you it could go in different directions. Out of playing with those scenarios, you are going to get indicators of in which direction the world is moving. And it will help you react faster when you realize the world is actually moving away from the kind of situation that you had envisaged that had become the implicit foundation for your strategy. And very often, those assumptions about the future are not explicit, and they are dangerous in the sense that if they are not explicit, you haven't thought through the vulnerabilities. And the scenarios can help you figure out a way of reacting faster when you see the signs that the world is actually going in a different direction from what you had assumed.
Okay. Thanks. So one question that comes up is how important is accurate information when developing these scenarios? Bearing in mind the current situation we're in with the crisis, and there's a lot of talk about different measures being used, different or not all information being disclosed. What's the role of information? Can you make scenario thinking or scenarios in a situation where you have not perfect or very imperfect information?
Um, in some senses, I think having I don't know if that exists, but having perfect information or a lot of information, it could be a dangerous thing because it makes you think that you know what the future is going to look like, and that's I think one of the worst things that you can do as a strategist, to think that you know what the future is going to look like, um, and instead, and if you think about, so what could the future look like? And a good set of scenarios has two legs. Essentially, one leg is rigorous analytics. So the better data you have, the better the starting point you will also have. But the second one is you have to be creative and skeptical. Think about the kinds of things that were considered or that might be considered unlikely. And all you have to do is think back a few months and you will have a very good example of that. And then explore that and think about how could that be something that is actually plausible, that who could happen. Think one of the big differences between, say, models which rely on good information, good data, and scenarios is that models essentially cannot understand inflection points. So models tend to be in one way or other very linear, and therefore, in as much as the world is extrapolation of the past, they work very well. Now that doesn't happen very often. That's not the real world. And scenarios are a way of looking for inflection points and then trying to understand the implications of those inflection points, of fairly fundamental changes, which don't happen all the time. But when they happen, if you haven't understood what it means, you are going to miss out in terms of opportunities and in terms of risk management as well.
Okay, just to finish off and finalize this webinar, we want to stick to those 30 few minutes. One question coming from the audience, two questions coming from our viewers. One is, what about oil price? What do we do with oil price in this analysis? And secondly, what is your opinion on how the health strategies are coming out?
Well, on the latter, I really don't know anything about health strategies. I think that the key in in a situation like this, whether it is health catastrophe or a natural catastrophe of a different time, is to make sure that you have learning loops that are active and that you are quickly adapting from what you learn in one place and another, etc. And that seems to be happening. And I think that that's what you need to make sure. Coordination, dialogue, cooperation, all of those things matter. Um, and then, of course, I think what matters, and I think what we see everywhere, and I gather in Spain in particular, is the dedication of people in that sector, and that's a huge asset. And without that, you couldn't kind of get out or be optimistic. The oil price, well, I think the oil price is something that everybody who's tried to project it, even under normal circumstances, has been wrong just about every time. Um, so rather than saying where is this going to take the oil price, what I could say is that an important thing about the oil price is that it has very asymmetrical effects. So if you're India or Spain, you benefit from low oil prices. If you are an oil producing country, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and now the US, at least in some parts of the US, then you lose when the oil prices go down. So you need to think through what this means in geopolitical terms and geoeconomic terms, in addition to everything else. It's not something that is either good or bad, period.
Okay. Thank you very much, Enrique, for this wonderful talk. Always great to talk to you. Just a reminder for viewers, there is a little short piece on scenarios and strategy by Enrique in Esade's Do Better blog, which I recommend you to look up. In any case, from at Esade Geo, we will continue to think of scenarios, and we'll continue to take into account all these great global trends that are happening, and to help businesses navigate the future. In any case, Esade will do another webinar tomorrow with Professor Ana Gines, who will be looking at employment effects in Spain in general, but in Spain of the crisis. It will be in Spanish. And with that, goodbye, and thank you all for assisting today. Stay well.
Thank you.